I've learned that a long life doesn't always grant you wisdom, but it does give you a front row seat to your own mistakes. This is the story of my biggest one, and what I did about it when I had nothing left to lose. The smell of old paper and lemon polish in the Charleston City Council chambers was the smell of my entire life's work. My hands, spotted with the geography of 66 years, rested on the cool, worn oak of the speaker's podium. Across the room, seated at the grand mahogany dais beneath the city seal, was Councilman Alistair Finch, a man I'd called my friend for half a century. We were gathered for the final vote on the zoning variance for the old Huguenot House on Tratt Street, my passion project, my legacy, my financial ruin or salvation. And as Alistair leaned into his microphone, a camera flash glinted off his gold cufflinks, and he smiled a predator's smile right at me as he began to speak the words that would publicly execute my reputation. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The story really begins 50 years earlier, on the sun-drenched grounds of the Citadel, where Alistair Finch and I, Arthur Macleod, were two inseparable cadets. He was the golden boy, the scion of a family whose name was etched into the very cobblestones of Charleston. I was the son of a history professor, quiet and bookish, fascinated not by the grand Finch monuments, but by the mortar that held them together. Our friendship was an odd one. He had the charisma, I had the knowledge. He would charm his way into parties at the grand homes south of Broad, and I would be the one he'd call when a history paper was due on the very architecture of those homes. He saw my passion for Charleston's bones as a quaint, useful hobby. I saw his political ambition as a force of nature, something to be admired from a safe distance. After college, he went into law and then local politics, a seamless glide into the power that was his birthright. I became a historical preservation consultant. A mouthful of a title for what was essentially a building whisperer. I could tell you the vintage of a nail by the shape of its head, the story of a family by the scuffs on a heart pine floor. For 40 years, I built a reputation on meticulous honesty. My word was my bond. My handshake was a contract. I consulted on the restoration of the Dock Street Theater, advised on the reinforcement of the Battery's seawall after Hurricane Hugo, and helped dozens of families navigate the city's labyrinthine historical review board. I loved my city. I loved my work. And I loved my wife, Eleanor, who understood my quiet passion and shared my simple life until she passed 5 years ago, leaving a silence in our little house on Queen Street that I tried to fill with work. That's when the Huguenot House came along. It was a wreck, a magnificent, crumbling Georgian relic on Tratt Street that had been left to rot for decades. It was the architectural equivalent of a forgotten masterpiece. Its bones were exquisite, but its skin was peeling, its foundation was sinking into the pluff mud, and the city had slated it for condemnation. But I saw what it could be. More than that, I knew its history. It was once owned by a free man of color in the 18th century who'd been a master silversmith, a story lost to time. To save it wasn't just about saving a building, it was about saving a piece of Charleston's true, complicated soul. It became an obsession. I poured every cent of my retirement, every dime Eleanor and I had saved, into buying it. To fund the restoration, I took out a massive loan, leveraging our home, the place where we'd raised our daughter and mourned our losses. It was the biggest gamble of my life, and it was entirely dependent on two things: a specialized zoning variance for mixed commercial residential use and the accompanying historic preservation tax credits. Without them, the project was financially impossible. I'd be bankrupt. Before I even signed the first check, I sat with Alistair in the courtyard of the Mills House Hotel, under the shade of a palmetto tree. He was a councilman now, powerful and connected, the very picture of Charlestonian grace in his seersucker suit. "Alistair," I said, laying out the blueprints, my hands trembling slightly. "I can't do this without the city's backing. I need to know you're with me." He placed his hand over mine, his signet ring cold against my skin. His eyes, the color of a stormy Atlantic, were filled with what I mistook for sincere warmth. "Arthur," he said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon, "this is exactly what Charleston needs. Men like you, with integrity and vision. You have my word." I'll personally shepherd this through the council. Consider it done. His word. In my world, that meant everything. So I drained my accounts. I hired the best craftsmen. For 2 years, I poured my life into that house. I aged 10 years, my back ached, but my God, it was beautiful. I oversaw every detail, from sourcing period-accurate cypress for the shutters to restoring the delicate plasterwork myself. The Huguenot House began to breathe again. All that was left was the final, formal vote at the city council meeting. A rubber stamp, Alistair had called it. A formality. The council chambers were packed. Reporters were there, other preservationists, developers. My daughter, Sarah, who was in her last year of law school up in Columbia, had driven down to support me. She sat in the front row, her face beaming with pride. I gave my presentation, my voice filled with passion as I spoke of the silversmith, of the building's unique heritage, of what it meant to the city. I showed them the pictures, the before and after, the painstaking work. I finished to a round of warm applause. I sat down, my heart hammering with a mix of relief and triumph. Then, the chairman of the council turned to Alistair. Councilman Finch, you've been the primary liaison on this project. Your thoughts? Alistair stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked not to the podium, but to the center of the floor, commanding the room's attention. He looked at me, and the friendly warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian focus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, he began, his voice ringing with a false sincerity that turned my blood to ice. I want to thank my old friend, Arthur Macleod, for his passionate presentation. The slight pause before the word passionate was the first drop of poison. He has indeed done a remarkable job restoring the facade of the Huguenot House. A truly beautiful job. He paused again, letting the praise hang in the air before twisting the knife. But as we dig into the specifics of this variance request, a troubling picture emerges. He held up a file folder. My file folder. The one with all my financial projections, my historical research. My work. Mr. Macleod speaks of history, Alistair boomed, but what this variance truly represents is a classic case of developer greed, cloaked in the noble language of preservation. A confused murmur rippled through the room. My jaw went slack. Sarah looked from Alistair to me, her smile erased, replaced by utter disbelief. He is asking for an unprecedented commercial rezoning in a strictly residential historic neighborhood, Alistair continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. He wants to turn a public treasure into a private cash cow, a boutique hotel and a private residence for himself, all subsidized by taxpayer credits. It was a grotesque lie. The plan was for a small museum on the ground floor dedicated to the silversmith and 2 modest residential apartments above. It was all in the proposal. He knew that. He had helped me write it. He is using his reputation, his knowledge of our city's codes, to exploit loopholes for personal profit. He is setting a dangerous precedent. If we approve this, we open the floodgates for every carpetbagging developer to come in and carve up our history for a quick buck. He was using my own arguments, the very words I had used for decades to protect the city, against me. He painted me as the villain I had spent my life fighting. He concluded, turning to the council, his face a mask of solemn duty. Charleston's history is not for sale. I love this city and its heritage too much to stand by and watch it be plundered by cynical opportunists. Therefore, with a heavy heart, I must strongly urge this council to vote no. And I will be leading that vote. He sat down. The silence in the room was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I looked at the faces in the crowd. My friends. My colleagues. Their expressions had shifted from admiration to suspicion, to pity, to contempt. In 5 minutes, Alistair Finch had taken 40 years of my life, my integrity, and burned it to ash in the center of the room. The vote was a formality, just as he'd promised. But not in the way I'd expected. Unanimous. No. My variance was dead. My project was dead. I was financially annihilated. Sarah rushed to my side as the reporters swarmed, shouting questions. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at Alistair. He was accepting handshakes and pats on the back from his fellow council members, looking for all the world like a hero who had just saved the city. He caught my eye across the room. He didn't look away. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He simply held my gaze, and with the slightest of movements, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if to say, checkmate. The days that followed were a gray, featureless fog. The bank sent a notice of default. The craftsmen I'd hired, men I'd known for years, called, their voices a mixture of pity and anger, demanding the money I no longer had. My name, once a synonym for integrity in Charleston, was now whispered with scorn in the very circles that had once celebrated me. Arthur Macleod, the greedy old fool who got what was coming to him. Alistair's betrayal was so total, so audacious, that it was perversely brilliant. He hadn't just defeated me, he had redefined me. I was a pariah. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped leaving the house. The shame was a physical illness, a constant, low-grade fever that left me weak and hollowed out. Sarah stayed with me for a week, a fierce, protective presence in the suffocating silence of the house. She cooked meals I couldn't eat and raged against Alistair with a fury that I was too numb to feel. We have to sue him, Dad, she insisted, her law book spread across the dining room table. Slander, tortious interference, there are a dozen things we can go after him for. I just shook my head, staring out the window at the garden Eleanor had loved so much. On what grounds, honey? That a politician changed his mind? That a friend lied to me? There's no law against betrayal. He used my own data, my own words. It's my word against a man who practically owns this city. Who would believe me? I believe you, she shot back, her voice cracking. Doesn't that count for anything? It counted for everything, but it couldn't pay the mortgage. We both knew it. After a month of this self-imposed exile, the first for sale sign went up on the lawn of the Huguenot House. The bank was foreclosing. A few weeks later, another sign, like a second nail in the coffin, was hammered into the lawn of my own home on Queen Street. The house Eleanor and I had filled with a lifetime of memories. Everything was being liquidated. Everything was gone. My first clue that this was something more than a simple, cruel betrayal came on a Tuesday. I'd forced myself to walk down to a little bakery on King Street, seeking some semblance of normalcy. Huddled over a sticky bun and a bitter coffee, I kept my head down, my hat pulled low. Two men sat in the booth behind me, their voices the familiar low-country drawl of local businessmen. I recognized one of them as a real estate lawyer named Middleton. Finch played it perfectly, Middleton said, his voice low and smug. Made the old man Macleod out to be the bad guy, killed the variance, and tanked the property value into the ground. So the Phoenix Group gets it in the foreclosure auction? The other man asked. For pennies on the dollar, Middleton confirmed with a chuckle. Alistair gets his fat consulting fee from them under the table, they get the prime Tratt Street lot, and the council will approve their hotel variance in 6 months when nobody's looking. Clean and simple. My heart stopped. Phoenix Group. I'd never heard of them. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a conspiracy. Alistair hadn't just abandoned me, he had actively, methodically engineered my destruction for profit. He'd used me as a pawn to acquire the property for his real partners. The coffee went sour in my stomach. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked out of the bakery, leaving my half-eaten bun behind. The Charleston sunshine felt harsh, alien. The city I loved suddenly felt like enemy territory. Every smiling face, every polite nod, seemed to hide a dark secret. For the first time, the numbness began to recede, replaced by a cold, quiet rage that felt like a coiled snake in my gut. That evening, I called Sarah. I told her what I'd overheard. The anger returned to her voice, but this time it was different. It was sharp, focused. Phoenix Group, she said, the sound of her typing echoing down the line. Okay, they're a big development firm out of New York. Very aggressive. They specialize in luxury hotel properties, and their legal team is a pack of wolves. Dad, these are not small-time players. What can we do? I asked, the helplessness creeping back into my voice. We can dig, she replied, her tone hardening with a lawyer's resolve. Alistair wants to be mayor. He's announcing his campaign next month. Men like that, men who are that arrogant, they get sloppy. They believe their own press. They leave a trail. We just have to find it. For the next few weeks, my quiet house on Queen Street became a war room. The dining table, where I was supposed to be signing closing documents, was now buried under maps, public records, and printouts from obscure city databases. Sarah drove down every weekend, her youthful energy a stark contrast to my weary cynicism. She was the digital native, navigating the arcane world of LLCs, campaign finance disclosures, and shell corporations. I was the analog historian, the one who knew the city's physical and political geography, the old family connections, the pressure points. We started with the Phoenix Group. As Sarah suspected, they were pros. Their connection to Alistair was buried under layers of corporate anonymity. But then I had an idea. Forget their new deals, I told her. Look at their old ones. Look at every major development deal in Charleston for the last 10 years that involved a controversial zoning change. See who voted for it, who profited from it, and which lawyers papered it. It was like pulling at a single loose thread on a grand tapestry. Slowly, painstakingly, other threads began to come loose. We found a pattern. 3 separate times, a historic property had been bought by a small, local LLC. A variance request from that LLC would be denied by the city council, with Alistair Finch giving a passionate speech about protecting Charleston's heritage. The property would then go into foreclosure, only to be snapped up by another LLC, this one with ties that, after 3 or 4 corporate handoffs, led back to the Phoenix Group. And a few months later, a new variance would be quietly approved. Alistair would either vote for it or conveniently abstain. The lawyer on record for all of those mysterious LLCs was Middleton, the man from the bakery. It was a racket. A well-oiled machine for shaking down property owners and manipulating the system. Alistair wasn't just a corrupt politician, he was the gatekeeper. He used his reputation as a champion of preservation as a weapon, deciding who got to build and who got to be ruined. And I was his latest victim. His masterpiece. He'd used our friendship, my life savings, and my public reputation to set the whole thing up. He had fattened the calf before the slaughter. The rage I felt was no longer hot. It was glacial. An immense, slow-moving weight of fury. I now had the what and the how. But we had no hard evidence, nothing that would stand up in court against a man like Alistair Finch. We had a pattern of behavior, but the links were all circumstantial. Any decent lawyer, and Phoenix would have the best, would shred us. He's untouchable, Sarah, I said one night, the defeat heavy in my voice. He's insulated himself perfectly. Legally, maybe, she said, looking up from her laptop, her eyes glinting in the lamplight. But you said it yourself. He's running for mayor. That's not a courtroom. It's a theater. And in a theater, facts are only part of the story. The narrative is everything. I didn't understand. What are you talking about? She leaned forward, a grim smile on her face. His power comes from his name. The Finch family. They're Charleston royalty. His entire image is built on being the latest in a long line of noble public servants who built this city. She tapped a key on her laptop, and an old black and white photograph of Alistair's great-grandfather appeared on the screen. He's using his history as a shield. I looked at the photograph, at the stern, bearded man who had been a senator a century ago. And then I looked at Sarah. And an idea began to form in my mind. An idea born not of legal statutes or financial records, but of something far older and more powerful. An idea born of the very history Alistair claimed to champion. He had used my life's work to build my prison. But I had spent my entire life studying the history of this city. All of it. The noble parts, and the dark, forgotten secrets buried beneath the cobblestones. Especially the secrets of the families who thought they were royalty. A cold, sharp clarity cut through my despair. Alistair's history wasn't his shield. It was his weakness. And I knew exactly where all the cracks were. The decision to fight back wasn't a single thunderclap moment. It was a slow, quiet dawn. It happened a week before I was supposed to be out of my house. The movers had already packed up most of Eleanor's things. I was standing in my study, surrounded by boxes filled with a lifetime of research, old maps, property deeds, handwritten journals, forgotten city records. The raw materials of memory. I picked up a photograph of Eleanor and me, taken 30 years ago on the steps of the Huguenot House, long before I ever dreamed I would own it. Her smile was so bright, so full of a future that had now been stolen and sold for parts. Alistair hadn't just taken my money and my reputation. He had taken this. He was trying to erase the narrative of my life, of our life, and replace it with his own fabricated story of my greed. He thought because I was old, because I was quiet, because I played by the rules of a world he no longer believed in, that I was weak. And as I stood there, holding that photograph, the grief and the rage finally coalesced into something new. Something hard and clear and cold as steel. Resolve. He used history to ruin me, I whispered to the empty room. I'll use it to bury him. That night, Sarah helped me set up a blog. It was a simple, anonymous platform. We called it Charleston's Attics. The premise was unassuming, a blog dedicated to unearthing the forgotten stories and hidden histories of the Holy City, written by an amateur historian with a passion for primary sources. It was the perfect cover. For the first few weeks, that's all it was. I wrote about the construction techniques of 18th century wrought iron gates. I posted a long-form piece on the Gullah Geechee praise houses that once dotted the Sea Islands. I detailed the history of single houses and the architectural reasons for their design. I was meticulous, citing my sources, linking to digital archives, and posting photos of obscure documents. It was my life's work, repackaged for a new audience. The blog started to gain a small following among local history buffs, professors at the College of Charleston, and even a few journalists who covered city culture. No one knew who was writing it, and that anonymity was my armor. Alistair announced his candidacy for mayor to great fanfare on the steps of City Hall. He gave a soaring speech about his family's deep roots, their centuries of service to Charleston, and his sacred duty to protect the city's unique character. He was the favorite, the heir apparent. The local paper, the Post and Courier, endorsed him almost immediately. He looked invincible, wrapped in the lion skin of his family's legacy. He was a Finch. That was supposed to be the beginning and the end of the argument. That's when I began to pivot. I didn't go after Alistair. Not directly. I went after his foundation. My next blog post was titled The King Cotton Fortune of Senator Thaddeus Finch. Alistair's great-grandfather. The man in the photograph. Publicly, Thaddeus was remembered as a statesman. But I had spent years in the city archives. I knew where the real records were kept, not the polished, official histories, but the shipping manifests, the slave trade ledgers, the private journals. I wrote a detailed, impeccably sourced account of how the Finch family fortune wasn't just built on cotton, but specifically on the trading of slaves and the ruthless exploitation of post-Civil War sharecroppers. I didn't editorialize. I didn't draw any modern conclusions. I just laid out the cold, hard facts, complete with scanned images of the original documents. The ledger with Thaddeus Finch's signature authorizing the sale of a family. The property deeds showing land acquired from illiterate freedmen for pennies. The post ended with a simple, haunting line: history is not always what we remember, it is what the documents refuse to let us forget. The effect was subtle at first, a ripple in the calm pond of Charleston society. The post was shared in academic circles. A history professor mentioned it on a local NPR show. People were talking. It didn't attack Alistair, but it stained the pristine marble of his family name. A week later, I published my next piece, The Great Wharf Fire of 1922 and the Finch Shipping Lines. The official story was that the fire was a tragic accident. The Finch family was even lauded for their charity in the aftermath. But I had found an insurance investigator's report from 1923 that had been buried in a forgotten municipal file. The report strongly suggested arson, pointing to the fact that Finch Shipping Lines was on the verge of bankruptcy and that the insurance payout, from a policy that had been suspiciously tripled just 2 weeks before the fire, had saved the family from ruin. Again, I just presented the evidence. The report. The financial statements. The newspaper articles from the time. I was dismantling the Finch legacy, brick by brick, not with accusations, but with their own forgotten history. People started digging. Other historians, intrigued by my sources, began to verify my claims. The narrative began to shift. The name Finch was no longer associated solely with statesmanship and philanthropy. Now, whispers of slave trading and insurance fraud clung to it like Spanish moss. Alistair was too arrogant to notice at first. To him, this was just the ramblings of some anonymous crank. But his campaign manager, a sharp political operator from Atlanta, surely saw the danger. A candidate can survive a personal attack, but it's much harder to survive the poisoning of your entire origin story. The narrative was becoming, is the Finch family legacy one of public service or one of public plunder? My daughter, Sarah, was my secret weapon in this quiet war. She monitored the online chatter, tracked which articles were getting the most shares, and identified key influencers, journalists, academics, and activists who were following the blog. "It's working, Dad," she told me over the phone, her voice electric with excitement. "You've created a counter-narrative. You're not attacking him, you're just providing context." That's when we found the kill shot. It was my discovery, but it was Sarah's brilliant legal mind that understood its true power. I was researching land grants from the late 19th century for a post about the phosphate industry. I was looking at a map of landholdings just outside the city, near the Ashley River. I recognized the layout immediately. It was the land that now comprised the Finch family's ancestral estate, a sprawling, magnificent property that was the very symbol of their power and permanence. According to the map, and the accompanying deeds from the 1870s, that land had belonged to a community of Gullah families, freed slaves who had been granted the land as part of Reconstruction. But the deed transferring the land to Thaddeus Finch in 1878 was a mess. The signatures from the Gullah families were all just an X. The witness was a known associate of Finch. And the sale price was listed as $1. It wasn't a sale, it was a theft. A legalistic, state-sanctioned theft from a group of newly freed, illiterate people. The foundation of the entire Finch dynasty was built, quite literally, on stolen ground. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice a hushed whisper as she looked over the scanned deed on my laptop screen. "This is the one. It's not just about something that happened 150 years ago. It links the family's historical sins directly to Alistair's current wealth and status. He lives on the stolen land. It makes the past the present." The final, televised mayoral debate was scheduled in 1 week at the historic Dock Street Theater. It was to be the centerpiece of Alistair's campaign, his coronation. "We have to time this perfectly," Sarah strategized. "We can't just drop it. It has to land like a bomb." We spent the next few days crafting the post. It was my masterpiece of historical demolition. Every claim was backed by an unimpeachable source. Every link was triple-checked. It laid out the story of the Gullah community, their names, their lives. It showed the original land grant. And then it showed the fraudulent $1 deed signed by Thaddeus Finch. The night before the debate, at exactly 10 p.m., we published the post. The title was simple, $1 an acre, the founding of the Finch estate. Sarah immediately sent the link to a curated list of contacts, the most influential political blogger in South Carolina, a national reporter for ProPublica who specialized in historical injustice, and the leader of a prominent Gullah Geechee Cultural Preservation Society. Then, all we could do was wait. I felt a strange calm. I had laid the gunpowder. Now, all we needed was a spark. The night of the debate, I didn't go to the Dock Street Theater. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the near-empty living room of my house on Queen Street, a single lamp casting long shadows on the packed boxes around me. The television was on, the local news channel broadcasting the event live. Sarah was there, in the audience. She had secured a ticket through her university. She wasn't there to protest or to shout. She was there to bear witness. The first hour of the debate was predictable. Alistair was smooth, polished, and utterly in command. He deflected questions about his development policies with practiced ease, turning every answer into a paean to Charleston's glorious future and his family's role in its past. He looked every inch the mayor. My anonymous blog post had been spreading like wildfire through the city's political and media circles all day, but no one had dared to mention it on air. It was still a fringe story, a digital ghost haunting the edges of the mainstream conversation. The moderator, a well-known local news anchor, announced they had time for one final question from the audience. A woman stood up, a professor of African American Studies at the College of Charleston. Sarah had sent her the link that morning. Councilman Finch, the professor began, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the polite applause. Your campaign is built on the strength and integrity of your family's history in this city. I'd like to ask you about a story that's gaining considerable attention online today, from the historical blog Charleston's Attics. On the screen, I saw Alistair's smile tighten almost imperceptibly at the mention of the blog. The moderator looked momentarily confused, but the professor pressed on. The blog has published what appear to be original city records from 1878. Suggesting that the land your family's famous estate is built on was acquired from a community of freed Gullah families for the sum of $1. The Post alleges the transaction was fraudulent and predatory. As a man who has built his career on protecting Charleston's heritage, could you please comment on this troubling piece of your own family's heritage? A stunned silence fell over the theater. It was as if a grenade had been rolled gently onto the stage. The moderator, seeing the explosion of activity on his own tablet from his producers, realized this was now the story. Councilman, a response, he asked, his professional neutrality barely concealing his excitement. Alistair was, for the first time in his life, completely blindsided. His charisma, his weapon of choice, was useless against a 150-year-old document. That is an outrageous and unsubstantiated smear, he stammered, his polished veneer cracking before a live television audience. It's an anonymous blog. The desperate ramblings of some crank, time to disrupt this election with baseless lies. The documents are posted online, sir, the professor retorted calmly. They appear to be from the city's own archives. Are you saying they are forgeries? The camera zoomed in on Alistair's face. The beads of sweat on his upper lip were unmistakable. He was trapped. To deny the documents was to call the city's own records fake, an easily disprovable lie. To admit their existence was to validate the entire story. He tried to pivot. This is a distraction from the real issues. My opponent is clearly behind this cowardly, anonymous attack. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had not just been planted, it had bloomed in the harshest possible light. The story was no longer about a blog. It was about the documents. It was about the stolen land. It was about the lie at the heart of the Finch legacy. In that moment, he ceased to be Alistair Finch, the inevitable mayor of Charleston. He became Alistair Finch, the descendant of thieves. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The next morning, the story was on the front page of the Post and Courier. Finch family legacy questioned after document dumped, the headline screamed. Reporters were camped outside his estate, the estate. The Gullah Preservation Society held a press conference demanding a formal investigation. The national media picked up the story, framing it as a perfect microcosm of historical injustice and modern political hypocrisy. His opponent, a previously lackluster candidate, now had a silver bullet and fired it relentlessly. Alistair's campaign went into a defensive crouch from which it would never recover. His donors grew skittish. His poll numbers plummeted. The Phoenix Group, the New York developers who valued discretion above all else, quietly pulled their back-channel support. They had no interest in being partners with a man at the center of a racial and historical scandal. Without their money and influence, Alistair's power base crumbled. He lost the election 2 weeks later. It wasn't just a loss, it was a humiliation. A landslide victory for a candidate no one thought had a chance. The Finch dynasty was broken. A few months later, under a new city administration, the zoning board quietly reopened my case for the Huguenot House. With Alistair's corrupting influence gone, the variance and the historical tax credits were approved unanimously. I was able to secure new financing, pay off my debts, and finish the restoration. I sold my house on Queen Street, as I'd planned, but not out of desperation. I moved into one of the small apartments above the museum, just as I'd always dreamed. I was no longer ruined. I was home. The day the museum opened, a small, quiet affair, I saw him. Alistair was standing across the street, half hidden in the shade of a live oak. He looked smaller, grayer. The swagger was gone, replaced by the stoop of a defeated man. He was just staring at the building, his face a mixture of envy and hatred. He wasn't looking at a restored piece of architecture. He was looking at the monument to his own downfall. Our eyes met across the cobblestones. There was no acknowledgement, no flicker of the 50 years of friendship we once shared. There was nothing left but the bitter ashes of his ambition and the quiet strength of my survival. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the Charleston crowds, just another ghost in a city full of them. I watched him go, then turned back to the warm light spilling from the doorway of my beautiful, resurrected building. He had built his legacy on a foundation of buried stories, never realizing that some men spend their entire lives learning how to dig. The end.